like I mentioned, is the second week in the Creative Job Search series. Next week will be the resume section, and that Marnie will be doing that one. After that, we have the internet and social media with a focus on LinkedIn. We'll be talking about job interview on the 22nd, and then right before the start of the new year, the always well-attended Facing Unemployment at 50 and Older. But today we're going to be talking about identifying your skills. Now, the reason we do this as the second week is because if you're going to write a resume, you're going to do an interview, what you're going to be talking about in that resume and in that interview is, of course, your job history, but more importantly, you're going to be talking about the skills that you've developed within that work history. And many people do not consider that thoroughly enough before they start their job search. So we're going to be talking about identifying skills. We're going to be talking about some skills that would be transferable, and that's very important because very few of us are going from the exact same type of work that we used to do into the next job, meaning that we're mostly going to be learning something new or doing something different. And the skills you use to describe what you did in your past jobs will need to be changed a bit to describe their validity and how they relate to the new job. So we'll be talking about that throughout the section. We'll also be talking about applications and work portfolios. So first off, what we're gonna do is do a little quiz. So a skill is just something you can do. Okay, so it's anything you can do. The question I want you to put in the chat box, and this is just going to be a number, how many skills do you think the average person has? And while you're thinking about that and typing that in, I will answer the question that came into the chat box. Yes, the presentation will be sent to everybody with the speaker notes, so you don't have to write everything down. We'll also be recording this, and a recording will be available by the end of the day tomorrow. I hope to include that in the follow-up material also. So we're getting a wide variety of answers here. I like 20 plus. That's a very good way of saying, hey, I've answered the question because it's anything 20 and above. I see 100, I see 30, I see 25, I see 10. Someone's very specific. They said 24. And we see up to 500. There's another 30. When we used to ask this in person, people were very concerned that they would be called on, so they would say something like 3, in case they had to give their skills. The average person, and this is not someone with multiple degrees, the average person has 500 to 800 skill sets. Now, first time someone hears that number, they don't believe it or don't trust the number. I very much believe in this number because what most of us do when we're talking about a skill set is we're talking about a job title. So an example, if I'm a welder, that's my skill. There are multiple that's involved in being a welder. At the very basics, you do cast iron, aluminum, MIG, TIG, wire feed. That might even be MIG and TIG. I'm not a welder. I don't know that profession. But someone in that profession may assume that if I say I'm a welder, that the recipient, whoever's receiving my application or looking at my resume, is going to know what that means. And the truth is they don't. We need to break it down for them, especially if they ask for specifics. Okay? So the average person can only identify 10 skills. And some people have even a harder time than that. The average person can only identify 10 skills because think too broadly. You really need to break it down. Now, does that mean you're going to put 500, 10 good ones? I like that. Does that mean you're going to put all of those 500 to 800 skills? By the way, it'd be very hard for anybody to come up with 500 to 800 skills because things we do, we don't even consider to be skills. However, they're all potential marketing pieces. And that's the key here. Before you write your resume, think about what am I going to market? And if you're going to market a job history, that's fine. I mean, that's part of it. But within that job history, the real marketing is what you accomplished there. And if you take a pen and paper and write down as many skills as you can, whether you think they're usable or marketable or not, that's the start to your job search, because you're thinking about, okay, what can I market? And then the next step would be, who do I market that to? And the following step would be, how do I use those skills to market myself to that individual? So there's a lot of pieces there. The reason I break it down like this is many people start with the resume and they just think, okay, I'm going to put my employment, where I worked, who I worked for, and they're going to know what I did there. And of course, employers don't. Now, the percentage of people who cannot identify, sell, or prove their skills during an interview. I'm going to give you this one too. You don't need to put this one in, but I really, really like talking about this number. 80% of people have not fully considered what they're marketing and how they're going to sell their skills in an interview. And the reason I love that number is when I hire somebody, I've done a ton of hiring, but I've probably hired 30, 40 people in my career. When I interviewed, I always interviewed 5. I shot for 5 people to interview. Now, if you think about that, if I'm interviewing 5 people, 1 person gets a job, that means there's a 20% success rate for that group of people. Anyone in that pool of candidates has a 20% chance of getting the job. The other 4 people who didn't get the job had an 80%, and this is a horrible term to use, but failure rate or non-success rate. Let's put it that way. It'll be a little more positive. And the reason is not because they didn't have the skills. Potentially, it at least could have been, not because they didn't have the skills, is because they hadn't identified those skills and marketed them to me. Because remember, at interview, unless I've known you from a past work experience, I know nothing other than what's on your resume. How well you sell what was on your resume and additional things within an interview will help me to determine whether you're a fit for this company, whether you have the skills. So it's great that you get to the interview, but once you're in the interview, then it's, that next level of talking about your skills and having a game plan in your interview. That's what I always think about. When I go to an interview, I have a list of 5 skills. That's my game plan. Here's the 5 things they need to know about me in order for me to get this job. Now, those 5 skills are not necessarily my best skills, but they're my most relevant skills based on that job description. When I look at that job posting, that job description, I match my skills to their needs. And I think, what 5 things I have to offer this job? And then I make sure I don't leave that interview until they know those 5 skills. And I've given them examples. We talk in the interview class about how to, do star stories and behavioral-based questions and how to answer those while putting your skills into those examples. But the first step is identifying the skills. We're going to stop intermittently here throughout the presentation to answer any questions that may come up, and that's what Marnie's been doing. I'll stop right now just to ask if there's any questions we need to get to.
Yes, someone says they believe there was a suggestion in another webinar not to list all skills under a job title because the person reading the resume would already know what skills fall under that particular job title. So can you clarify a little bit, please?
So part of it is you don't want to try to be everything to everybody. Don't say you're the best at every single thing they're asking for. However, if they're asking for a skill, you need to tell them that you have that skill. I'm not exactly sure. It might have just been a misunderstanding of how it was phrased, but you definitely need to talk about what their needs are. If they're asking you if you have something, if you don't tell them you have it, how could they possibly come to the conclusion that you're someone worth interviewing? I use the same words they use. So I'll give you an example. If someone were looking for a facilitator, so you could say I'm facilitating a workshop right now. In the past 20 years, I've considered myself to be a trainer. It's not lying or making things up to say I'm also a facilitator, but I'm going to use their term to describe my skills. But you definitely do need to talk about, especially those skills that are required. If you don't list the required skills on your resume and give some proof of that, it's a very easy way for employers to filter out your application, your resume. I mean, that's the whole purpose. An application is a filtering device. It filters out applicants that aren't qualified. The only way we can show we're qualified is to respond to questions asked. You have this. I hope that answered the question. Are there any more we need to get to before we move on, Marnie?
Just to reiterate that people can find the recordings of all previous sessions on our virtual and interactive page, and I will put that in the chat box.
And that's also part of the follow-up material. So thank you, Marnie. All right, so how do we develop skills? Very natural process that we do, whether we're thinking about it as a process or not. We do it through work experience, through education, volunteer work, socializing, hobby, sports. All of the above is how we develop our skills. The most important for most employers, in fact, I would say all employers, is going to be work experience. So if you have work experience in a skill, but you also have it in several other opportunities, you don't need to list them all. You don't need to say, well, I've done public speaking extensively at work, but I also did it through my education and my volunteer work and socializing. This is the most important one. If you don't have it through work experience, that doesn't mean that you can't list it. You're just going to have to prove you have it through talking about a situation. So if you did it through volunteer work, you might do it under a different heading on your resume. Hobbies, I've only done that twice in my career where I've said a hobby is the reason you should hire me or how I developed this skill. And the reason was the only experience I had in that skill was through a hobby. If I had it in work experience, I wouldn't even listed the hobby because in most cases, a 1 to 2 resume is what employers are looking for. Not all cases. There are exceptions to every single rule or every single opinion out there. But the most important is work experience. So if you have your skills developed through that, that's usually sufficient examples to give. So the types of skills that are most important to employers, and I'm going to quantify this a little bit by saying at interview. During the resume and the application, they're asking for a lot of hard skills, but in many cases, they're asking for soft skills also. At interview, that has a much bigger part in the equation. That's why they ask you those behavioral-based questions. How do you deal with conflict? Give me a situation in which you've had a disagreement with a coworker, with a boss, with a customer. Those aren't hard skills. Those aren't how you weld or how you computer program. They're how you deal with people. They're people skills. And will you fit in and can you adapt and learn? Those are the most important because every single job that you get, the next job you get, they're going to have to train you in. Hopefully, by getting to the interview, you've shown that you have the hard skills necessary. At interview, a lot of the focus is on the soft skills. Will I be able to train you in our way of doing those skills? You have those, welding skills from a previous employer. Can I teach you how we weld here? And that's, will you adapt, learn? So during the course of an interview, I always include one example of how I've adapted to a new process. Because if throughout your career, I'm sure you've been in a situation in which there was a new way of doing things that was instituted at your company. And most people will resist that. They'll resist change. In fact, every single time I've ever had a major overhaul of a process at work, people complain about it. And doesn't mean that that's a better way of doing things, but because it's the direction the company is going, I like to show that I've adapted to it, I fully embraced it, and I kept an open mind about it. And those are trainable people. Those are the type of people that will work well with change. And so change is a big part of any job, and talking about that in an interview and the skills you use is going to be important. So the reason we go through this whole thing, the reason we're actually here today, and how is to talk about how identifying your skills will help you in your job search. What it'll do is help you to prove your abilities to potential employers. It'll give you stories to tell. It'll help you to write your resume and complete applications. I mean, putting job titles and dates of employment is a small piece of the puzzle. It's the easiest piece, by the way. I've looked at resumes that only had dates of employment and job titles, and they list them, and it takes up about half a page, and there's 20 years of work history there. That doesn't say a lot, other than, I'm not trying to dismiss that longevity and working within a company for a certain period of time isn't important. It certainly is, but talk about why they kept you on that long. What value did you show? What skills were important to that employer to allow you to work there that long? Most importantly, because this is what I call the gatekeeper of jobs, is the interview. It helps you to sell your quality in an interview. And again, going into the interview of here's what they need to know about me. That are most important to this job based on my experience and my knowledge and research I've done. Here's what they need the most. And then give examples of those skills. Give success stories. So there are 3 types of skills. We talked about soft skills, and then there are the hard skills, the job-specific skills. And then the one that most of us are going to have to really look at is transferable skills. So public speaking, that would be a great example. So you may have been, like myself, a facilitator at one point. Well, maybe in this new job, you have to run a safety meeting, or you have to represent your company at a job fair. But it certainly is. So that's a transferable skill from a different type of industry that transfers to this new opportunity. And in many cases, that's the thing you really need to focus on, is because the type of job or the title of job or the employer is different, what history. So the reason this is important is multiple. One, it gets you into a company. It can also make you invaluable to that company. I always like to try to think of, okay, I've got this. How do I keep this job? What added value can I give to the at the job posting and the interview and the application and the resume? I speak really specifically to their needs. If there's something that would very well be assumed to give added value, I might include. But once I start working there, I want to let them know a little bit wider, give them a little bit wider definition of what my skill sets are, so that I can increase my value. I don't volunteer for everything. I don't try to do things that I am not qualified or experienced in. But if you're willing to take on a project because you have an extra set of skills that maybe someone else doesn't, that's going to lead to job security. So Bill Gates once said, "My people have the confidence of their convictions and they know their skills." So everyone going into the job hunt, the first thing we should look at is, do I know what I have to offer? We'll pause at this point and get to any questions that might have come up.
So one person says, I was told to apply for jobs even when I have only one of the required skills. Would you agree with that, Art?
Depends on how many they list and how they were listed. So if you were to ask an employer, and say, okay, you've got this 5-page job posting. Really expect someone to have all of those skills. Depends on a couple. One is, are they listed under required skills, or are they listed in beneficial skills? That can be kind of tricky. So I'll give you an example. If the job requires you to be bilingual, and it says required, must be bilingual in English and Spanish, and you have every other skill set they're looking for, but you don't have that, I would say, yes, that's a deal breaker. And I personally wouldn't, because that is so much a part of the job. Now, if it were listed, somewhere in the job description as it was, a plus, or it was somewhat vague on if it's an actual, extremely important part of the job, yes. I mean, there are very few jobs out there in which you're going to have everything an employer wants. If you have the majority of what they want, usually I personally would apply. Be able to talk about a skill they list as either a current skill, an in process skill, or something that you have done the research on. So here's a great example. What if someone were applying for a job and you had everything they were asking for except advanced knowledge of Excel? But if you have everything else, gosh, I might apply for that. But if I'm at interview, what I'm going to be telling that employer is I am currently taking the GCF learnfree.org course on advanced Excel and am increasing my knowledge daily. I spend 15 minutes a day on this course, and I've learned a lot of new things, and I'm excited to put them into practice at your position. One skill, if the job is requiring quite a bit and you only have one skill, you may be wasting your time. The reason you may say, what difference does it make? They're just not going to interview me. I'm still putting my hat in the ring. The problem with that could be, I've seen that go badly, is I've had people that have a monofocus on an employer. Let's say they wanted to work for United Healthcare. And United Healthcare, they post a ton of jobs. They're hiring quite a bit. And if you apply for 20 different jobs, some employer will look at that and say, how invested are you into any of these opportunities, or do you just want a job? And that may be the case. You may just want times in our life where we just need a job. But attractive employer, because if you just want a job, what's going to happen when a better job comes along? You're going to jump to that job. So if you're applying for everything, even things you're not qualified for, it can leave kind of a set a bad precedent with you and that employer. Marty, do you have anything to add to that?
I would agree with everything you said. There are certain situations where we see people discount themselves too often or too early. The only thing I would say is that if you're waffling a little, make sure that you would be able to defend your ability to learn new skills, and that's going to be for any job seeker, because like Art said before, every place you go, you're going to have to learn how they do things, even if you're doing a very similar job. All right, we have one more good question here that I want to touch on. Should you adjust your resume to each job posting depending on their criteria?
So first off, let me tell you that the answer is yes. But before I get too much into that, I want to say it's not rewriting your entire resume, because people put a ton of effort. Okay, that was good for one job. Now you're doing another job. All you're doing is slightly adjusting it. So if you're in the same industry, so let's say there are 3 hospitals in the applying for a health unit coordinator position at all 3 locations. You might think, well, it's the same job, the same field. I can use that same resume. Only if they're all using the same job posting, because all employers will talk about their needs differently. I'm sure all of you have heard of the term applicant tracking software, ATS. What that will do is it'll take a job posting and it will take all the resumes, and it will try to do keyword searches and match words. So like in the example of when I said I was a trainer, but they're looking for a facilitator, even though a person could look at that and say, I understand those are the same thing, a computer will not. Even to the point where you put in PowerPoint or QuickBooks with a space between those words, it might not match. So make sure you're using the exact words. So if they're looking for Microsoft Office and you have it, great, list it as Microsoft Office. But if they're looking for Word, Excel, Access, and PowerPoint, you need to list it that way. In fact, when in doubt, put it both ways. Now, not all businesses use applicant tracking systems. People have this misconception that that all businesses are doing this with a computer. They're not. Even the state of Minnesota, in many cases, doesn't. It's a person looking at that, looking at the job posting and trying to match resumes to the words on the job posting. They're not going to read into and research your resume extensively. So it's really important to slightly adjust your resume to the needs of that employer. All right, let's move on to applications. Applications, it's changed quite a bit in my time in doing this type of work. When I first started doing this, we had a 5 filing cabinets, at least I did, that had every single application from every employer that I could find that I could get an application. Try to keep a current list and current copies of all these applications. And when someone wanted to apply at a local place, I would pull out an application and we would fill it out as neatly as we could, and that's what we would use. Now, there are still employers that do that. I've seen them even recently, even with this heightened need for distancing, which online applications certainly help with. There are still employers that are looking at paper applications. But whether you do it on paper or whether you do it online, have your information ready before you start. That means have exact dates, addresses, phone numbers, salary, etc. Have that all that information there, because this is a legal document. If you lie on an application, and by lying I mean you put the wrong information, that could be grounds for dismissal, even if you get the job, but could also take you out of contention for the job. I do realize that getting exact dates can be difficult. So do it now before you're applying. Because what happens, I have found, at least in my career, is I never find a job that I'm really excited about when I'm ready. I always find it when it's the last minute and it's a tremendous opportunity and I need to get it out really quick. If you have all this information ready to go, you can apply in a timely manner, and that is extremely important, because ideally you're first in. You don't want to be last in. Sometimes that's the situation, and certainly don't, fail to apply for a job you really like simply because it's closing that day. But if you can apply early, do it, because that shows that you really want the job, and maybe you are researching that company and you're waiting for that job. So what I'm going to be sending everybody today is a kind of a worksheet that you can fill out. It's a fillable form that you can put all of those dates and addresses and phone numbers. I used to do it a personal information sheet as a brochure, which would really help in filling out applications when you got to a location. But this is really helpful even to have printed off. So when you're filling out an application, you're working from good copy, because you can be messy even online because you misspell things and you don't capitalize, or you put the transposed dates. So have all that information. Use that resource that I'm going to send everyone. You want to be positive and honest. You do not need to explain things on applications unless they specifically ask you. Okay, so I've seen people make the mistake of, they put the reason they left every single position. Quite often be asked, how did you leave your most current position? But again, you don't have to go into too much detail. For many, many people right now, they're in a situation they haven't been to in a long time because of the pandemic. They're unemployed, and employer's just not going to understand that I'm unemployed due to COVID. A lot of people are unemployed right now due to COVID. It's the most, I guess, accepting employers will be for the foreseeable future about long-term unemployment, because they're dealing with it every day with all of the applications that are out there. So be positive, be honest, don't go into an extensive detail, and make sure you're never trying to state your case for why you were in the right and someone else was in the wrong. That is an application. So if you don't use the keywords on applications, it can screen you out. Remember, this is a filtering device. Your resume is a marketing tool, but it can still be used as a filtering device in ways, because some employers look at the resume first, and then they look at the application. But each of these need to stand on their own, the application and the resume. I found this out several times in interviews, in which I referenced something I had put on my application, and the interview committee had never seen the application. And that shocked me. I thought, if you're going to interview someone, you're going to look at the application. In many cases, they don't. That's the HR department's world. They look at the applications. In many cases, the interview committee only looks at the resume. So I've had people argue with me that I don't need to put any of the stuff that I put on my application in my resume because I'm just repeating myself. Well, remember, they have slightly different purposes, but they both need to stand on their own. It's a chance to use your skills, so use the space wisely, especially if you are uploading your resume as part of filling out your application. Some applications will allow you to upload your resume, and then it fills in a bunch of stuff on the application. Go through that very carefully, because it doesn't always parse correctly. It always doesn't, go into the right situations or the right fields. So make sure you're putting it in exactly as it needs to go, especially if you have something other than a chronological resume. A skills-based or functional resume will not work well in pre-filling out applications because it's just the format's different. I'm not saying you shouldn't use that format. I'm just saying be very careful in how it helps you in that application. Be sure to follow directions. If you leave something off your resume, off your application, if you leave something blank, sometimes that takes you right out of the system. I don't even like putting NA. I would put not applicable instead for some reason. I just think that is going to be less blank than NA. However, be neat. Make sure you're capitalizing, make sure you're punctuating correctly. And if you're working off good copy, off a sheet or a sample application, in many cases, what I've done in the past is I fill out a sample application. And even though the application I'm going to actually be filling out is slightly different, a lot of the things are the same as far as education and some of the skills and some of the fields. All right, we're going to do a little quiz here in a minute, but I'll stop just for a question or two if there are any. Marnie?
Absolutely. With the number of job postings on LinkedIn and their easy apply button, should our LinkedIn profile match the resume, and should you forego using the easy apply to go and use their formal application on their website?
I tell you what, I haven't had success with that. That easy apply and that LinkedIn is a profile. It's not a specific marketing tool. So when you think of a profile, think of it as, here's what I want to be to an industry. A resume is what I want to be to an employer. One of the questions we get quite a bit in the LinkedIn classes I've taught, and we'll be talking about that in 2 weeks at the social media section 4 of Creative Job Search, is you don't adjust your LinkedIn every single time you are applying to someplace. That would be exhausting. And also you would be filling up your connections feed with all of your updates. There's a way to turn that off, I guess. But you want to think of your LinkedIn as, here's who I am professionally for the type of work I generally go for. So if you do 2 types of work, let's say you are an accountant and you're a bartender. Choose what you are currently going for as a career and focus on that. You don't want to have what we call a split digital personality and try to be a whole bunch of different things. I've been everything from a Mason's block tender to a wedding event DJ to a facilitator. If I put that all on my LinkedIn profile, it's going to be messy and confusing for everyone I'm trying to direct to that profile. So it has to be general enough that it could match several employers' needs, but it can never be specific enough, in my mind at least, to work as an application. Now, you may have different results. Your industry may work well with that. However, I would always attempt to be as specific as I can with my my applications. Have you run into that, Marnie, at all?
You know, I am such a rule follower, and I automatically will go to the employer's website, do their application process exactly as it says there, and then reach out in other ways. So maybe if I haven't heard anything, I would use that easy apply button or contact the poster or something like that. But my number one thing to fellow job seekers is to go directly to the employer and apply through them, including what they ask for.
I completely agree. Thanks. So we're going to do a little quiz here. And don't worry, there's no right or wrong answers, but there's no tricks also. I'm going to give you 4 lines of text, and all I want you to do is proofread it. I want to proofread it for one specific test. I want you to count just within this area, not up here, just this white area right here. I want you to count the number of Fs, F as in Frank. So take 15 seconds, count the number of Fs you see, and in the chat box, I want you to put in that number, please. Again, I'm not trying to trick you, so don't look for hidden meanings or anything like that. Just count the number of Fs and put the number in. Okay, so I'm seeing 3. I think I saw 33, but I'm pretty sure that was a double entry. I see 4s, I see 6s, I see 5s. Now, one of the things you should get from this, if you're seeing the chat box, you may ask yourself, how in the world can anyone see something different than I'm seeing? Because all he asked us to do was count the number of Fs, and it's very obvious to me how many Fs there are. So if you saw 3, and I see 3 as probably 50% of them, so we have finished, files, and scientific. Okay, and those are 3. You're absolutely right. There are 3, but there's 3 more. Of, and of. Now, this is not an intelligence test, so don't worry about that. Thank you, John, for the wow. I saw this, and I was working overnights in an Alzheimer's care unit, and there was a late night news program, and they brought this up, and I was astounded. I thought, how could I possibly miss that? And when they said there were 6, they played it up a little bit, and they said there's 6. Look again, and I looked again, and I couldn't see it. The reason I show this is, 1, it's kind of fun, but 2, it shows how easy it is to miss something extremely simple. So you were looking at this, for many of us at least, for the first time. You had no preconceptions of what was there, and you still missed half of what was asked for. Now imagine your resume or an application in which you've lived it. You know what it should say. So you're far too close to that to look at it objectively. It's very easy to miss things. It's very easy for things to make sense in your mind that will make absolutely no sense to an employer, especially in like a cover letter. So I think it's really great to do the buddy system. At the very least, do the buddy system. Have someone else look at it. Now, I work for the state of Minnesota in the Career Force system. We have people at each Career Force location that can be your buddy in this. Now, ideally, you are using that to start a relationship, to help someone understand what you have to offer an employer, and maybe it leads to some career exploration. But the easy way in, a friendly request, could you please look at my resume and proofread it? Now, we're not going to write a resume for you, but they can help you clean it up. And some of the errors are as simple as formatting issues. That's easy to fix. The thing is, you can find things that you would look at 20 times and never catch, like this. So kind of a fun exercise. So one of the questions we run into that's very difficult on an application is, why did you leave your last job? Now, the reason for this is it's a very emotional question if you fired from a job. or even if you were laid off from a job that you really, really identified with. I mean, think about it. The first question someone may ask you is, what's your name? The second question is, what do you do for a living? Okay. So if I was a facilitator or a manager 10 years and all of a sudden now I'm not, that's a very emotional question. Why did you leave that position? So if you were fired, truly fired, I just put involuntary separation. Currently, that's the best language that tells the truth, that doesn't try to explain why I was let go. Now, if you were laid off due to COVID, due to whatever reason, then I do go into a little bit more detail. And the reason I do that is a lot of people who are fired, they don't want to say that. And by the way, never put fired or dismissed or let go, put involuntary separation. But they want to own up to it because they don't think it's their fault, and it may absolutely not be their fault. So they will say I was laid off or it was a mutual decision, which isn't the truth. So when you say you were laid off, go into a little bit of proof. Say laid off due to COVID downsizing, or laid off due to company restructuring. Now, if you left that position, I would never say quit because quit, that just the questions I have when someone says quit. So you could say voluntary. Now, if there were a perfectly legitimate reason you left, like it was due to relocation, maybe you moved, you were living in Idaho and you relocated to Minnesota, you say voluntary separation due to family relocation. Now, when I say that, many people will ask me, hey, they can't ask if I'm married or if I have kids, and I just gave them that information. Well, I always think help my situation or explain something, it's to my benefit, then I don't mind them knowing. I wouldn't mind anyone knowing I am either married or have kids. I have 5 kids, but I may give them information that benefits me. Be very, very careful about that. I just give a little bit. I quit and left the employer, with no return on their investment. We get into portfolios. I'm going to stop just for a minute here to field any questions that may have come up.
Sure. How far back would you go when listing your job history?
So, like I've said, and I'll probably say it won't finish today, there are exceptions to everything I'm going to be talking about today. But usually 10 to 15 years is far enough back. Now, one of the questions I get quite a bit is, well, what if something 16 years ago was really relevant and it's the most important thing to this opportunity? Well, then there's an exception for you. But if the 16, 20, 30 years ago just backs up what the current 10 to 15 says, you can leave it off. Another tricky situation is you've worked for the same company for 30 years. I want to show how old I am, but I can't say I only worked at that company for 15 years when in fact I worked there for 30. That's a perfect situation in which you can reach out to a local career force location and they can give you some creative ways. And I don't mean creative ways of lying, creative ways of telling the truth that helps you. So an example, I know someone who worked at a company for 46 years. Now, if that person were looking for work, they don't want to say the 60s or whatever. Very few people work at a company for 3 decades, 4 decades in the same exact position title with the same division and the same company name. In many cases, you could say, I worked for years as a quality improvement supervisor or a inspector. And the previous 15 before that was with the same company, but it was a different title. So you don't necessarily have to put it on that resume. But again, there are so many variables to this that if you're in a situation like that, talk one-on-one with a career force specialist, and they're going to really help you kind of figure out what the best method of putting that resume together would be. Any more questions before we move on, Marnie?
Yes. Responding to a salary question on an application. How do you go about that?
So you might ask, or might not want to answer that question. It's kind of like, you're bargaining for a car. You want them to make the first move. How much is this car? Well, how much are you willing to give me? Who's going to, blink first? I'm going to put in I think I got this right. Deed has some salary survey tools, some data tools that will help you to understand about what a job pays for a certain type of job in a certain area. So that's really important. So let's say that a job range for a position is between 40 and 70. And you're like, oh my gosh, of course I want 70. Maybe I want 80. Maybe I put 80 in there. Well, yeah, there are some considerations. You don't want to price yourself out, but most employers are just looking for you to validate why you're worth that much. So be willing to back out based on research why you are worth that much. So the data tools will give you a range, and then within that range, you can ask, or you can research. I have 5 years, 10 years, 20 years of experience. I'm going to be at the top end of that. If I am just brand new, sure, I want the top end. I'm not going to ask for the absolute bottom, but I'm going to give a legitimate range. Stress too much about it, because that I found out in the interview is that the interview committee had no idea what my salary range was. I said, well, I put that in the salary range, and they said, we don't see that. I was shocked by that. So don't stress out too much about it, but be realistic in what you're doing, and also be willing to back up why you're worth that much. I think that tells an employer a lot. It's one thing to ask for the top end, the other thing to say, here's why I deserve, or I think I deserve that top end. That salary tool, there's some training videos on there. There's a lot there. There's a lot to dig into, but it can really help you research education opportunities, whether an occupation is in demand, what an occupation pays in an area. It's a really great tool to add to your job seeking toolbox. All right, we'll get to other questions, as many questions as we can after we get through the content, but I do want to move on to portfolios. So what are portfolios? Many people think of a portfolio as like an artist portfolio. It has your paintings, and certainly if you're a graphic artist, it would be an expectation that you would bring a portfolio. However, I think everyone can bring a portfolio to an interview, or start developing a portfolio so it's ready when you start to interview. What you include in it is copies of your resume, the cover letter that you sent out, a reference sheet to hand out if it's asked for, possibly a letter of recommendation. I think the top level job seekers will also include work samples. And you say, well, how can I show an example of my welding? Well, pictures of your welding. I've seen some incredibly neat welds in pictures that immediately make an impression. And then copies of certificates or licensures. So I've been in a situation where I hired somebody and they put a bunch of stuff on their resume, and it was all true, but it took me 6 months to get all that information from that employee to HR, who had to document that information. And it was a very muddled process. It took tons of emails, a lot of my time. Imagine my joy when the next person I interviewed had all of those things in a portfolio. They had copies of their certificates. They had work samples. They had their college transcript. They had everything I could possibly need if I hired this person. Think of the soft skills that shows. That shows organization to a high level. Every job would benefit from a well-organized employee. It shows, thoughtfulness. It shows, preparation. There's a whole bunch of things that it does. Now, just because you have a portfolio and you bring all this stuff, it doesn't mean you're going to use it all. But it's stuff that potentially could have an impact. One of the questions I get a lot is letter of recommendations. When do I put that in? It can be put in at multiple times. If it's possible, sometimes it can be put in with the application. Generally not, but sometimes it can. It can be a follow-up if it's a network situation and the person who introduced you to the job is the recommendation you have. You might be able to send that off. I've given them at the interview. I've also sent it as follow-up material after the interview, but I always try to have a letter of recommendation with me, and certainly a reference sheet. If an employer does not ask for my reference sheet at interview, I asked them if they would like it. I said, would you like my reference sheet, a copy of my reference sheet? It depends on the situation and kind of how you're feeling that out, but don't assume that in an interview they're going to have a copy of your resume. I've been in multiple interviews where they haven't. And sometimes it was just an omission, and they said, oh, excuse me, Mr. Larson, we need to make some copies of your resume. And it was really, really cool to be able to say, oh, that's okay. I have a copy for each one of you. Now, does that mean you might waste some paper in printing off resumes and cover letters and reference sheets, for up to 10 people? It's certainly worth it. I don't get that many interviews. We apply for a lot of jobs. We don't get that many interviews, and hopefully the interview you get is going to result in a job offer. So it's well worth the time, effort, and the paper to put that together just in case. When you're doing a portfolio, one of the things that's really nice is it's a leave off. I put together this packet for you to help you in your decision. But if you're going to do that, think about something called branding. I think about in all aspects of job search, but you want to seem like the same person throughout the process. So all documents that you send to an employer should look like they came from the same person. This is your resume. And then you attach your cover letter, and it looks like this. See what's happening there? They immediately think, oh, this is well put together. It's nice and neat. And then they get this. They're going to assume that, well, this person went to the career force and got help with the resume, or they had someone professionally do their resume. This is what I'm actually getting. The impression is much better if you brand everything you put out. Your cover letter, your resume, your reference sheet. Look at the difference here. This is the same exact text. Didn't change anything. But in this, the font is different. There's no heading. It's all bunched up at the top. So taking just a little bit of extra time to brand your presentation and meet expectations in every document you send out is not that difficult once you've done one or two of them. Once you've done one or two, you've got the format. It can really help. It's a better initial impression. The first impression anyone has of an application, a resume, a cover letter is visually, what do I think about it? Before I read any content whatsoever, I get an impression about the document based on the format it takes. At this time, we have 5 minutes left, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So I'm going to turn it over to Marnie to handle that.
Okay. So backing up a little bit, can you go over again, what if we don't have dates of our employment?
So a couple things you can do there, and none of them are easy. I've had multiple people in my career say, well, I can't find those dates of employment because that company doesn't exist anymore. First and foremost, once you get the dates, put it someplace where you're going to remember it. Right now, I really recommend uploading it to a folder in like a Google Drive or a OneDrive, so that, if worse to worse and you move and your computer crashes and everything, once you have those dates, put it in a place where it can't be erased, and a cloud drive like Google Drive or OneDrive, or just email it to yourself. It's really going to help. So calling the former employer is a good idea. Even if you were fired, very professionally call them and ask for dates of employment. They generally will give that to you. I think they're required to. The other option, it's a lot trickier and it can cost money, is contacting the Social Security Administration. There's no free option in which you can get dates of employment, but for like $100, I think it's $96 or something like that, there is a process on their website. And I had someone do it. It's not really that bad. They've streamlined it a bit, but it takes some research on their part. If you paid taxes, if it was a tax-paying job, there's going to be a record, and you're going to have at least the years. You should have dates of employment there. If they require 2 years of employment, and you say that you work from 2002 to 2003, some employers, especially in the private sector, will give you credit for 2 days of employment because you didn't give specific enough information, and they can't assume. So they're going to say you work from December 31st of that 1 year to January 1st of that next year. So if it's specifically listed that you need 2 years of employment and you worked very close to that, give the actual dates. Or the actual months, but if you work someplace for 15 years, you can generally just give the years of employment. If you are guessing, don't guess April 17th, guess April 1st. When they ask for specific information, do everything in your power to get that specific information, and don't give up too easily. And unless you've exhausted everything else, keep trying. But there are situations that happen in which maybe it was where you can't possibly get to that information, then taking your best guess is the only thing you can do, but don't let that be your first choice.
Art, how do you feel about using templates for cover letters and resumes?
Personally, and this is my opinion, because I teach Microsoft Word quite often, most templates are set up in a table format, meaning that it's a very easy way of getting all the information on there, and people can click in a certain section and enter information. And I'm not saying that's bad, that you can certainly do that. The problem is it's not very adaptable. You can't switch that information. So yeah, if you want to start with a template, that's fine. But if it becomes very, very tricky to adjust that template to the needs of the next employer, you might want to consider doing something a little bit more malleable, like a tabbed resume. And that's just my personal choice. The one thing about templates that I would really caution you about, the flashier the template, the more clicks it gets. However, most of those flashy templates with people's pictures and lots of colors and Twitter handles are not meeting the expectations of employers in the Minnesota region. So don't try to impress people with something extremely flashy, and that's what a lot of templates look like. Simpler in most cases is better. We take one more question before we wrap it up here today.
Okay, should job history entries in the application be a copy from the resume, or should it be a different write-up?
Again, they stand on their own. We're a little bit more freeform in a resume, that we can do it how we want to do it, but sometimes it is. Sometimes it's going to be a copy over. However, there should be something that you add to a resume that maybe you're not allowed to in an application. But if someone is, looking at both documents, it's not just a copy from one to the other. However, some of that information, especially with work history, is going to be very, very similar. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you spending your time with us today. Remember to reach out to your local career force location with any additional questions you have. I'll be sending everyone the follow-up information by the end of the day tomorrow. Sometimes it takes a bit to get the video recording downloaded and edited and uploaded so that we can send it out to you. Next week, Marnie will be joining you for resumes. We also do have several other classes that you will have access to in the links that we send in the follow-up material.